Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things, including the first appearance of the brand new and upgraded spinny thing. Hooray! Now, today what we're going to tackle is Daimyo Boba Fett, inspired by his appearance in the Book of Boba Fett. This here is a 3D print from Skullforge Studios. Now, the reason why I've chosen their version specifically is that Skullforge has 3D printers all around the world. So even if you don't have your own, you aren't going to miss out. You can pick one of those up and they will all be linked in the description. I've had an absolute blast painting this dude. It was way outside my regular wheelhouse, let's say. So I thought for something to get started again, carry on with March and finish on a high note. Well, not finish, but anyway. All of the paints will be listed in the description below, same as always. Let's get started. So once you've gone ahead and tidied up your print, whether you've printed it yourself or ordered it from somewhere, this is what you're going to have. I've gone ahead and primed this fella with a spray of grey from Vallejo, their primer spray range, although the grey itself is not particularly important. We're starting from a medium to light grey instead of a black, because there are a fair few colours on here that we're going to want an easier time, basically, rather than having to paint up from black. But, of course, a lot of his gear is black. So I'm going to start here. I have Black Grey from Vallejo. This one, of course, you could stick to Corvus Black or similar from Citadel if you wanted to. And this is not a perfect black. What this is got a little bit of, well, funnily enough, grey to it. Reason being that I'm using this is that we have somewhere we can go. When I shade this, we're still going to have a little bit of visual interest. It's not going to be a pure flat black. And why am I using the Vallejo range? Well, it covers so well. So take your time here, and we're going to cover over all of his black gear with this black grey. I think you'll see very quickly what I mean by black but not. For our purposes, this is a perfect black, especially at this scale, but it's going to give us a little bit of room to maneuver when it comes to highlighting and shading it. We'll move on now and start painting the next largest areas of color, which is going to be his green armor. For this I am sticking to Vallejo. I'm using Retractive Green. Now this one you'll see on some pots it says Retractive, sometimes it says Refractive. It can never be simple, so we'll include the number for it as well in the description. This one will cover fairly well, but you might find on some of the flatter areas, like on his chest piece, or parts of his jetpack, that you're going to want to give it a second coat. That is way too much on my brush. Let's get some of it. Okay, so let's go around now and Retractive Green, or Refractive Green, or Reflective Green in some cases, his armor. Now we're starting to get somewhere. I'm going to move on now and I'm going to touch in his shoulder pads and these little knee thingies he's wearing. Now in some shots this looks almost orange. Whereas in others, and depending on how he's lit, it does look yellow. So I think yellow is more accurate. So I'm going to use here Aerial Yellow from Citadel. And this, I've added just a little bit of water as usual. But you'll see, coverage on this isn't quite perfect. But part of the reason why we've started from such a light grey is to help with this. The secret to yellow is once you've put one coat on, leave it alone. Go away, let it dry properly, because so often I see people, applying 2 or 3 coats over yellow that hasn't dried properly, and you will end up with awful streaky nonsense. But if we let this dry, apply a second coat, it's going to look much smoother by comparison. So let's go ahead and yellow in all of these details, and then I'll show you what one coat looks like when it's dry. And once that is dry, go get yourself some fresh paint. Even if you're using a wet palette, don't return to the same gunk you were using. It is way safer. It's going to give you a better result with fresh paint. Check that out. Now in some areas, like down on his knee, I did have an area where I splashed a little bit of black. And honestly, that's probably going to need a third coat. But that is not looking too bad up on these shoulders. So I'll finish these off now. And there you have it, yellow in 2.5 coats. Now I am going to need to tidy up the black a little bit, but I figured if I'm going to make a mistake, I want to splash over with the yellow because that will be far easier to tidy up. Now what I have is burnt red. This is another Vallejo color. This kind of sits just between corn red and Doombull brown. So if you wanted to make this, you could mix it up, or you could just buy the pot of Vallejo. It'll work either way. I'm going to use this to paint in these red gauntlets. And as well, if I flip him around, all the little nozzles on his jetpack, I'm just going to sketch in a line around the base of these in this reddish color. And I am going to need to tidy that up with some refractive question mark green, but not to worry there. I have a feeling I'm missing a detail with that. Oh, his helmet. The stripe across his vision slit, that would be in this red as well. So just remember that one too. One detail I am going to paint before it gets difficult to reach without hitting anything is going to be the stock on his rifle thingy he's carrying. I'm using dryad bark here. Now, this is a really dark brown, but it's got just this tiny touch of red warmth to it. Makes it a really nice wooden color. Speaking of brown paint with a little bit of red in it, I have here flat brown from Vallejo. Now again, if you want to stick to Citadel, then Mournfang Brown is a pretty close color here. But as always with most of these, I'm either picking because they are the perfect color or because the coverage is much better. And I think you'll see with flat brown, that coverage is just, perfect. As well, I think this is about as close as we're going to get for the leather gear that Boba Fett is wearing. So I'm going to paint in the gaiters, I guess these are. And we're going to paint in his belt at the same time with this. Something I was going to forget entirely, don't forget the straps and his holster to paint in this darker leather color. Areas that are going to be gold or bronze later, I have painted straight over the top with some brown. It will make it a little more difficult to see if you leave any mistakes behind later. So if you're worried about not hitting everything with gold, just paint it all brown as a base coat, and then it's not so bad if you do miss those areas. You'll also notice the tips of his fingers I have painted leather too, because that's what his gauntlets look like. That's pretty cool. I have now some flat black, and I'll let you guess what we're going to do with that. There's actually not a lot of pure black on the miniature itself, really just his blaster and his pistol up in its holster here. There's really only a couple of details remaining for our base coats. I have Retributor armor, and we're going to use this for all of the brassy, bronzy stuff that he's wearing. So his belt buckle here, and as well the little bits of doubler on his weapon belt here. There's a couple of little bits there that I do need to tidy up, but we can do that last. I have some Iron Hand steel. What I'm going to do is paint in just a few of the little silver bits. So there's a couple of these on his jetpack, one or two little bits on the back of these gauntlets he's wearing. Really, it's up to you how much of this you want to do. Now I've saved one final part for painting the body here. And this is really in the realm of if you want to, or if you just want to show off a bit, you've got a steady hand. What I've got is a little The Fang, and I'm going to paint just a little blobby circle on his chest here. And then pop a line through it fairly roughly. Now that's not going to show up too well at the moment, but again, something you can tidy up with your green. Now that won't look like much at the moment, and it certainly doesn't look like much on camera, but we are going to do more to that, of course. I've gone around and I have touched up all of my black areas and a few bits of the green, so we're ready now for our shade. For this, no great surprise, is my good friend and yours, Agrax Earthshade. So go ahead, grab yourself a nice big brush, and we are going to apply this fairly generously over the entire miniature, but you can skip his face because we're going to do something with that in a little bit. In particular, on areas like the yellow shoulder pads, if you get big blotches like this, just shift it around with your brush while it's still wet. But otherwise, let's bucket this bad boy on, let it dry for about 30 minutes. Now after that drying time, you'll see we get something that looks pretty close to screen accurate, shall we say. The dark grey that we used, which is not quite black, you see there is a bit of depth to that, and it works really well. The very first thing we're going to do, though, before we get to anything else, is go back again to some Aerial Yellow, because this patchiness on the shoulder pads is going to bother me. You could skip this by just going straight to the chipping stage, which I'm going to show you in a second. But a quick thin coat of Arial Yellow I think is going to help sell this look a little bit more smoothly. You'll see I'm not too worried about perfect coverage there. What I want to do is just fix up some of the blotchiness, and that's perfect. What I have is we're going back to that black-grey again, but this time I've got a raggedy old brush here, you see, with a funny old point. What I'm going to do is just dab some black-grey in random little spotches, particularly along edges of detail. So on his chest here is going to be a good spot. Up along these corners where we want to do some armor, digging things up. So just a few little patches of this in random as you can spots, and all the better if your brush does not keep a point. These little scratches will be much easier to see on the yellow, but I hope that you can see some of that reflected on the green from this angle. What I have, we're going back to our Iron Hand Steel, and I'm going to poke in just tiny little scratches against some of our bashed up dark grey. As always, you can tell I'm concentrating. This is not necessarily the easiest way of highlighting, but it does save you needing 3,000 or 4,000 different colours when all you want to do is highlight some armour. So this will work on both the yellow, the green and the red. You'll see I've done some of this on the gauntlets too. It is something where it's very easy to go overboard quite quickly, but I think at this scale, it looks better if you do go a little chunky with it. You'll see that's very quick and quite effective. Really easy way of doing that highlighting without having to muck around with 8,000 extra paints. Speaking of though, we are going to do some highlighting, mucking about with 8,000 extra paints, and I'm going to start with Eshin Grey. You'll probably see I have applied some of this already to his cloak here. Now, this is quite a dark grey, ordinarily one that I would use for painting black as well, and again, here I am concentrating so I'm whispering, but you can use this just to help sketch out some of the extra shape. I'm going to use this just on his cloak. You'll see why in a little second here. Now, seen from this angle, what I've done is to essentially bulk out and sort of accentuate the shape of the folds in the cloak there. It's not 100% accurate to how the folds are actually flowing. There's a little bit of interpretation here, and some of it is just down to personal style, what you like the look of. Paint a lot of cloaks, and you'll find something that works for you. I'm moving up now. This is Skaven Blight Dinge, and I'm going to do just a little bit of this on some of the extreme edges of the cloak. So flicking my brush lightly, there we go, until I find those edges. But as well as the cloak, once I'm finished with this, I'll spin him around and use Skaven Blight Dinge to highlight some of the black on his clothing. Now this, I would suggest, it is easy to very quickly go overboard with. So just pick some of the areas, like on his knees here, where you've got this ribbing, just flick along there. Don't worry too much if you get it into the creases. It's really about just helping create a shape. I've just gone and forgotten my own very good advice, and I've probably added a little bit too much of that grey there. Honestly though, if you don't like the look, you can knock it back with a little bit of Nuln Oil in some areas, but I think this is going to look fine. Black can turn grey very quickly if you are too generous with your highlights, so sort of step back every now and then, stop and look at what you're doing and think to yourself, is this too much? I have now, this is Storm Vermin Fur, and I'm going to go just a little further in some extreme creases, and then we'll call that black finished. That's a little further than I would ordinarily go with painting black clothing. I would ordinarily just dry brush it before we get started on the base coats, but I wanted to do something a little extra here. So 3-stage highlight, yeah, why not? That looks quite cool. I have now a little bit of red leather. This is again a Vallejo color. Scrag brown works quite well in its place if you're looking for a Citadel alternative. Let's just very quickly highlight, no guesses here, is red leather. And you want to be fairly sparing with this because it is pretty fierce going on. Now the very last thing that we are going to do on the body is to paint in the icon on his chest. Now, when I was a kid, I thought this was his... I thought it was his baseball team or something. Yeah, not much has changed in the intervening years. I'm still not very bright. I have here a little bit of white. And what we're going to do is start off by painting the stripe section in the center. Just very lightly and just dab a shape. You know, it doesn't have to be a perfect line. Oh, goodness me, that's not perfect at all. I need a smaller brush. All right, I've gone down to a much smaller brush. This is the Insane Detail brush from the Army Painter. I have painted over that fang with the fang again. And let's go back to my white. Now, as always, the trick here is a tiny amount of paint on your brush at a time. And make sure that it will flow. It will flow. Flow is important rather than coverage here. All right, let's jump ahead slightly. I did find it extremely difficult to get this looking even remotely close. What I had to do in the end was to go back over it with the fang a third time, and then basically tickled in a little white line, and I'm going to leave it like that. It's impressionist. I think at this sort of scale it will work just fine. Yeah, I'm not that great at freehanding, but I think a little bit of persistence, you'll get something close enough. So yeah, that looks all right to me. Let's move on at last, and we're going to start painting his face. In order to base coat his skin, I have here New Wood. Now this is from the Panzer Aces line from Vallejo. Anywhere that you can order the ordinary model color, you'll be able to get this too. That's probably a little bit thick. Yeah, I'm going to thin that down a little bit more, but let's go ahead and apply this over his whole face. What I've got here, this is Dark Oath Flesh. It's a contrast color from Citadel. And this is roughly half and half with Lamian Medium. Now, I'm using this rather than the contrast medium because I want it to behave more like an ordinary paint or glaze than the contrast. Using this, we're going to introduce just a little bit of reddish warmth back to that skin tone, but without it being super overpowering. So let's cover his whole head in this, let that settle and dry. With that little bit of red warmth in there, we start to see a bit of life. I'm going to move on now. We have, this is Heavy Skin Tone from Vallejo. This is a Vallejo Game Extra Opaque color. So be mindful when you are using it that in this sort of application, you're probably going to water it down just a little more than usual. All the same, we're going to treat this similarly to how we would Cadian Flesh Tone over Bugman's Glow, which is to paint most of this skin in Heavy Skin Tone. So take your time, and we're going to cover over most of that, leaving just the recesses with that shaded New Wood. Now that is likely going to need a couple of coats, or at least a couple of passes while you're working here. I tend to like using a slightly thinned down skin tone. Reason being is you're not going to get a perfect coverage the first time you go over it, but let it dry, carry on painting the rest of the head, let it dry and come back and give it another thin pass, and you'll have some translucency in the skin tone. It does take a bit of practice, unfortunately. I can't tell you that there's a single easy way of doing it, but it's well worth having a play around, playing with the opacity of your skin layers. We'll move on. I have here Cork Brown, and we're going to use this as our highlight for a skin tone. So what I'm going to go for here is areas like his brows, his cheeks, and his nose. Now, I've just figured out what it is that's bothering me about this sculpt. The nose is just a little too pointy. So instead of highlighting it up and down, I'm just going to highlight essentially horizontally to try and make it a little more flat on his face. But places like his chin, let's get that in focus. His chin, his brows, up on his forehead too. The sculptor did a wonderful job of getting the angry wrinkles in his head here. But yeah, same principle, just a little bit of it in some areas. Play around, really experiment with painting faces, eh? If you're lucky enough to have a 3D printer, you have an endless supply of faces to practice painting, and it is extremely satisfying when you get them looking just the way you want. Now into that Cork Brown, I've mixed roughly half and half. This is now some Flayed One Flesh in there. And this is just so that we keep those skin tones a little bit of warmth. And now what I'm going to do is, again, just highlight extreme points on the miniature. So across his nose again, across his very tip of his cheekbones, and his chin. Now I noticed at last the sculptor had actually put the essentially guides for Temuera Morrison's funny little eyebrows, eh? And I love the look. So I got a little bit of black grey and just dotted those in. What I have here, this is a rough 50-50 mix of Drakenhof Nightshade and again Lahmian Medium. We want to keep this quite thin. I'm going to glaze with a find a point on my brush there. Let's get in there and add a little bit of this mix just under his eyes. And I'm also going to paint this into the hollows of his cheeks. You don't want too much to collect, so guide it away with your brush. And then using the same mix, I have here some Druchii Violet and Lahmian Medium, and I'm going to put a little bit of this just over his mouth. If I need to, I can highlight this up again. And yeah, that's going to be enough just to add a little bit of variety to the face. Now all that remains is take him outside, hit him with a matte varnish. Now I'm going to go ahead and base him in the same way that I did my Imperial Remnant Trooper, so I'll make sure that there is a link to that, but the recipe for this will be in the description. It's super simple. Let's get a look at what our Daimyo looks like when he's all complete. And there at last, Daimyo Boba Fett is complete. Now I say this all the time, but I think you can really tell this time I had a blast painting him. It's really fun to just grab something unusual, and though I'm not certain there's a specific sort of rule set for him in Star Wars Legion yet, having a Daimyo Fett ready might be a good idea. And beside that, it's just a really cool miniature, so I had a great time. As well, if you were looking at painting some clones, you want to paint clone troopers, they were Temuera Morrison, so how I'd paint this dude's head, well, there you go. That's how I'd paint clone troopers too. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support lets me do this cool stuff. As always, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.